2018, the Russian Wagner group had a bright idea to attack a U.S. base in Syria. The USA swiftly introduced them to the military meaning of the term overkill. Let me explain how this F around and find out moment unfolded. Back then, Wagner was a significant force, essentially an arm of the Russian army operating in Syria. They were looking to increase their income, and one way to do this was to secure, term used loosely here, oil facilities. Their plan was simple: take control of these facilities for the Syrian government and get a juicy share of the profits. Easy money, right? Well, they were about to learn a costly lesson in messing with the USA. The target was an oil facility near a demilitarized zone established by the USA and Russia to prevent accidental clashes. Both sides had agreed not to station more than 400 troops in the area. For Wagner, this seemed like a golden opportunity. They were used to slapping around much larger rebel forces in Syria, so they thought this would be a cakewalk. The math was simple in their minds: quick operation, then massive profits. Spoiler alert, the USA was about to make sure these Wagner troops wouldn't need any more money, ever. Now, the USA isn't stupid. They intercepted a phone call between Wagner, the Syrian government, and Moscow, where Wagner got the green light for this operation. There was just one tiny problem. A small detachment of US Marines and Special Forces was also in the area. This meant Russia couldn't get directly involved without risking a major international incident, but that didn't stop them from supplying Wagner with tanks, mortars, and other hardware. Real subtle, Moscow. A few days before the attack, US forces noticed troops gathering near the demilitarized line. Being the responsible adults in the room, they reached out to the Russian government to ask what was up. The Russians, in their infinite wisdom, claimed these were just Syrian forces they had no control over. The USA, with their intercepted phone call and other intel, knew this was bull, but they held back, thinking surely these guys aren't stupid enough to actually attack. Spoiler, they were. The Wagner force, about 500 strong, moved towards the oil fields. Standing in their way was a small group of around 40 US Rangers and Green Berets, backed by some local opposition forces. The US troops were outgunned and outnumbered, facing 30 armored vehicles, including tanks. But what Wagner didn't know was that they were being watched by US drones, and nearby US forces were on high alert. The stage was set for one hell of a showdown. At 10 p.m., the Wagner group decided to punch way above their weight class. Their armored column attacked, shelling the US base with mortars, artillery, and tanks. It was a relentless assault on the tiny outpost. US troops, badasses that they are, rushed to defensive positions and returned fire with small arms. But let's be real, that's like bringing a knife to a tank fight. Now here's where it gets interesting. The moment the attack started, the US Secretary of Defense got on the phone with his Russian counterpart and told him to stop the raid. Russian High Command responded with, "We don't have Russians in the area." USA said, "Understood." That understood wasn't just an acknowledgement. It was the sound of the USA taking off the kid gloves. An order went out: annihilate the attacking force by any means necessary. And boy, did the USA deliver. Within seconds, the full might of the US military in the region was unleashed. F-22 Raptors, the most advanced fighter jets in the world, took to the skies. Apache helicopters, the flying tanks that strike fear into the hearts of ground forces, spun up their rotors. B-52 bombers, the massive lumbering harbingers of destruction, were en route. MQ-9 Reaper drones, silent and deadly, locked onto their targets. F-15E Strike Eagles, versatile and lethal, joined the fray. AC-130 gunships, flying artillery platforms that can rain down hell like no other, entered the battle zone. And on the ground, every piece of Marine artillery in range zeroed in on the Wagner forces. What followed was a 12-hour campaign of destruction that would make Michael Bay movies look like a child's fireworks display. One Russian survivor later described it as a whirlwind of explosions, metal, and chaos. That's putting it mildly, buddy. The US forces didn't just repel the attack. They turned the entire area into a demonstration of overwhelming firepower. After the first 15 minutes, it was clear the Russian attack had failed. A sensible military might have stopped there, but the USA had a point to make. The Russians had repeatedly claimed they had no forces in the area, so the US decided to make that statement a reality. As the battle raged on, US pilots faced a dilemma. Jets and helicopters were running low on fuel and ordnance, meaning they'd have to return to base. For most, this would have been the end of their shift, but these pilots, true American heroes, refused to be replaced. They knew any delay could risk the lives of the ground forces, so they refueled, rearmed, and got right back into the fight. It was 500 versus 50, and these flyboys were damned if they'd let the 50 face those odds alone. Hour after hour, the US forces pounded the Wagner group. It wasn't just a battle, it was a complete obliteration. By the time it was over, the defending US soldier described the landscape as moon-like. Not a single living organism survived in the targeted square mile. The Wagner force, which had rolled in with such confidence, was reduced to twisted metal and scorched earth. After the dust settled, the USA contacted Russia again. The conversation probably went something like this. USA: "Hey, remember when you said you didn't have any forces in the area?" Russia: "Duh." USA: "Well, now you really don't. Feel free to come pick up whatever's left. If if you can find anything. Russia, showing their usual tact and honesty, didn't respond. They never officially confirmed any losses or even admitted Wagner was involved, but actions speak louder than words, and the numerous monuments that popped up in Russia commemorating fallen Wagner members tell a different story. Russian survivors claim they lost 400 men. U.S. officials put the number closer to 200. Either way, it was bad. On the U.S. side, one Syrian allied fighter got a scratch. That's it. Talk about a one-sided fight. In 2023, a Wagner-affiliated channel interviewed survivors from that operation. Their stories paint a picture of absolute chaos and destruction. U.S. drones had taken out the lead and last Wagner vehicles, trapping and confusing the rest. Apache helicopters blocked any attempt at retreat. By morning, the battlefield was a hellscape of liquefied metal and solidified sand. One interesting tidbit from these interviews: the Russian Air Force was supposed to provide cover but stayed grounded. Apparently there was an order for the pilots to join the fight, but they took one look at the F-22s patrolling the skies and decided they preferred being alive. Smart move, considering those F-22s would have turned them into scrap metal before they could say "Blyat." This operation was a wake-up call for Wagner. They realized they couldn't trust the Russian government to have their backs. We saw the results of that distrust in 2023 when Wagner briefly marched on Moscow, but that's a story for another day. Recently released documents shed more light on Russia's decision-making during the incident. Turns out, Russia had dense air defenses in the area, but chose not to use them. Why? Because they knew their hardware was no match for U.S. planes, and they didn't want the world to see just how outclassed they were. It would have been bad for business, you see. Russian military hardware is one of their big exports, and nothing kills sales like a public demonstration of inferiority. The USA, on the other hand, showed the world exactly what it's capable of. In a matter of hours, they demonstrated rapid response, proper logistics, and overwhelming force. For the U.S. Air Force, supporting ground troops isn't just a mission, it's a way of life. They operate under one unbreakable rule: no man left behind. This incident serves as a stark reminder of why you don't mess with U.S. forces. The USA doesn't just project power, it can bring that power to bear with frightening speed and precision. While Russia and others are still struggling to match fifth-generation fighter capabilities, the USA is already perfecting sixth-generation jets. And trust me, they've got some toys tucked away that'll only come out in a full-scale conflict. Let's hope we never have to see those. Since that day, there hasn't been a single instance of Russia challenging the USA militarily or even politically in Syria. The strikes stopped completely. The lesson is simple: actions have consequences. Don't mess with U.S. soldiers unless you're prepared to face the full might of the most powerful military in human history. The USA protects its allies and its interests with unwavering resolve and unmatched firepower. This is why the USA remains the world's superpower. It's not just about having the biggest guns, it's about having the will and the capability to use them when necessary. So the next time you hear someone questioning U.S. military might, just remind them of the day the USA turned Wagner mercenaries to mist. It's a stark reminder of what happens when you poke the eagle. Remember, a strong America means a safer world. Let's make sure it stays that way. Please follow so we can keep the USA the best.